The chandeliers cast a golden glow across the marble floors of Sunset Manor Country Club as I adjusted my wedding dress one final time. 26 years of life had led me to this moment, and everything felt perfect. The dress hugged my figure exactly as I'd dreamed, the flowers were arranged to perfection, and in 30 minutes, I would walk down the aisle to marry David Sterling, the man I'd loved for 3 years. What I didn't know was that in less than an hour, my entire world would crumble with 5 devastating words from the woman who raised me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rachel Donovan, and until that September afternoon in Millbrook, Connecticut, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was the eldest daughter of Margaret and Frank Donovan, a respected family in our small town. My father owned Donovan Construction, a business his grandfather had started in 1952. My mother served on the hospital board and organized the annual charity gala that raised funds for the children's wing at Cedar Ridge Hospital. We lived in the white colonial house on Maple Street with a wraparound porch that everyone admired during their evening walks. Growing up, I always felt slightly out of place in my family, but I attributed it to normal teenage rebellion and differences in personality. My younger sister Carolyn was the spitting image of our mother, with the same auburn hair, green eyes, and delicate features. She shared Mom's love for gardening and could spend hours discussing flower arrangements and interior design. I, on the other hand, had inherited what I thought were my father's traits: dark brown hair, hazel eyes, and a stubborn streak that drove my mother to distraction. The morning of my wedding started like something out of a fairy tale. My bridesmaids arrived at 7 sharp, led by my maid of honor and best friend since college, Jessica Chen. The bridal suite at Sunset Manor was decorated with white roses and baby's breath, and champagne was already chilling in silver buckets. My mother had spared no expense for this day, hiring the most sought-after wedding planner in Connecticut and flying in flowers from Ecuador. Mom bustled around the suite in her emerald green mother-of-the-bride dress, directing the photographer and making sure every detail was perfect. She'd been planning this wedding from the moment David proposed 18 months earlier, taking charge with the efficiency of a military general. Sometimes her enthusiasm overwhelmed me, but I was grateful for her dedication to making our day special. As I sat in the plush velvet chair getting my makeup done, I watched my mother in the mirror. Margaret Donovan was known throughout Millbrook for her elegance and grace. At 53, she maintained the same figure she'd had in college, thanks to daily yoga sessions and a disciplined approach to everything in her life. Her auburn hair was styled in a sophisticated updo, and her pearl necklace caught the morning light streaming through the windows. The makeup artist, a woman named Sophia, whom Mom had flown in from New York City, worked with the precision of a surgeon. As she applied the final touches to my lipstick, she stepped back with satisfaction. In the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The transformation was stunning, but something about my reflection troubled me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. My father appeared in the doorway, handsome in his charcoal gray tuxedo. Frank Donovan was a man of few words, but his presence filled any room he entered. At 56, he still had the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who'd worked construction before becoming successful enough to run the business from an office. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Dad had always been sentimental about milestones, and I could see tears threatening in his blue eyes. "Don't make me cry, Dad," I warned, though I was fighting back tears myself. "Sophia will have to redo my makeup." He crossed the room and kissed my forehead gently. "Your husband is a lucky man. David better treat you like the princess you are, or he'll answer to me." The photographer captured these precious moments, and I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for my family's love and support. David and I had been together for 3 years, meeting at a conference for environmental engineers where we both worked. He was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner: intelligent, kind, ambitious, and completely devoted to me. We'd bought a house together in the neighboring town of Brookfield, a cozy Cape Cod-style home where we planned to raise our future children. As the morning progressed, more family members arrived to wish me well. My grandmother's sister, Eleanor Hayes, whom everyone called Aunt Ellie, swept into the room carrying a small wrapped box. Ellie was my favorite relative, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and twinkling blue eyes, who always seemed to know exactly what to say. She'd never married, dedicating her life to her career as a nurse at Cedar Ridge Hospital before retiring 5 years earlier. "Something old for the bride," she announced, presenting me with the box. Inside was a delicate silver locket that had belonged to my great-grandmother. "It's beautiful, Aunt Ellie," I said, holding it up to catch the light. The locket was engraved with intricate flowers and felt substantial in my palm. "Your great-grandmother Clara wore this on her wedding day in 1943, Ellie explained as she fastened it around my neck. "She would have loved to see you wearing it today." As Ellie's fingers worked with the clasp, I noticed her pause. She seemed to be studying the back of my neck, her expression shifting from joy to something that looked almost like confusion. But the moment passed so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined it. "There," she said softly, stepping back. "Perfect." The morning flew by in a whirlwind of final preparations. My bridesmaids helped me into my dress, a stunning creation of silk and lace that had taken 6 months to design and create. The dress had been my mother's idea, inspired by a gown she'd seen in a vintage photograph. As they laced up the back, I felt like I was stepping into a dream. At 11:30, the wedding coordinator knocked on the door to announce that it was time for the processional. My bridesmaids lined up in the hallway, their navy blue dresses creating a perfect complement to the white roses they carried. Carolyn looked radiant as my matron of honor, her pregnancy just beginning to show beneath the flowing fabric of her dress. I took my father's arm as we positioned ourselves outside the ballroom doors. Through the glass I could see the 200 guests David and I had invited, including friends from college, colleagues from work, and what seemed like half of Millbrook. The string quartet began the opening notes of Pachelbel's canon, and my heart raced with anticipation. "Ready, Princess?" Dad asked, squeezing my arm gently. "More than ready," I replied, meaning every word. The doors opened and we began our walk down the aisle. The ballroom was transformed into something magical, with white fabric draped from the ceiling and thousands of tiny lights creating the illusion of stars. David stood at the altar in his black tuxedo, his face lighting up when he saw me. Next to him, his best man and brother Michael smiled encouragingly. As we made our way down the aisle, I saw familiar faces beaming at us from both sides. My mother sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Next to her was Dr. Helen Crawford, our family physician and one of Mom's closest friends from the hospital board. Dr. Crawford had been our doctor since I was a child, and she'd insisted on attending despite having to fly back from a conference in Chicago. The ceremony itself was everything I'd dreamed it would be. David and I had written our own vows, and when he promised to love me, through every season of life, in joy and in challenge, until our last breath, I felt my heart might burst with happiness. When it came time for my vows, I looked into his warm, brown eyes and promised to be his partner, his best friend, and his greatest supporter for all the days of our lives. Father Martinez, who had baptized me at St. Andrew's Church 26 years earlier, pronounced us husband and wife with a joy that radiated throughout the room. When David kissed me as my husband for the first time, the guests erupted in applause, and I felt like the luckiest woman alive. The cocktail hour that followed was a blur of congratulations, photographs, and champagne toasts. David and I moved through the crowd, hand in hand, accepting hugs and well wishes from friends and family. I was so caught up in the joy of the moment that I didn't notice the tension building around my mother until it was too late. It started during the family photographs. The photographer had arranged us in various groupings, capturing the traditional shots that would fill our wedding album. When it came time for the photo of just my parents and me, something felt different. My mother, who had been the picture of composure all day, seemed agitated. "Mom, are you feeling all right?" I asked as the photographer adjusted the lighting. "Fine, dear," she replied, but her smile looked forced. Just overwhelmed by emotion. Dr. Crawford appeared at my mother's side, whispering something in her ear that made Mom's face go pale. I couldn't hear what she said, but whatever it was clearly upset my mother deeply. "Margaret, perhaps we should step outside for some air," Dr. Crawford suggested. but my mother shook her head firmly. "No, I'm fine. Let's continue with the photographs." But she wasn't fine. As the photographer continued taking pictures, I noticed my mother's hands trembling. Her breathing seemed shallow, and she kept glancing around the room as if looking for an escape route. Aunt Ellie appeared next to us, her nursing instincts clearly activated by whatever she was observing. "Maggie, you look like you've seen a ghost," Ellie said gently. "Maybe you should sit down." "I said I'm fine," my mother snapped, which was completely unlike her. Margaret Donovan never raised her voice in public, and she certainly never snapped at Aunt Ellie, whom she'd always treated with great respect. The photographer finished with our family grouping and moved on to shots of David's family. I used the break to pull my mother aside, genuinely concerned about her sudden change in demeanor. "Mom, please tell me what's wrong. You've been acting strange ever since Dr. Crawford arrived." My mother looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of fear, guilt, and something that looked almost like panic. "Rachel, there are things you don't understand, things about our family that—"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She was interrupted by the wedding coordinator, who announced that it was time to move into the ballroom for dinner and dancing. The moment was lost as we were swept along with the crowd, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my mother had been about to tell me something important. The reception began with our first dance as husband and wife. David had chosen At Last by Etta James, and as we swayed together in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by the warm glow of candles and the loving faces of our guests, I felt like I was living in a perfect dream. Whatever had been bothering my mother seemed temporarily forgotten as she smiled and applauded from her table. The dinner was extraordinary, featuring herb-crusted salmon and filet mignon prepared by the country club's award-winning chef. David and I moved from table to table during the meal, thanking our guests for sharing our special day. At each stop I received compliments on how beautiful I looked and how perfect the wedding was. It was during the toasts that things began to unravel again. Michael, David's brother, gave a heartfelt speech about watching his little brother find true love. My sister Carolyn spoke about growing up with me and how excited she was to officially welcome David into our family. Then it was my father's turn. Dad stood up slowly, clearly emotional. He'd never been comfortable with public speaking, but he'd insisted on giving a toast despite his nervousness. He began by talking about watching me grow up, about my determination and kindness, about how proud he was of the woman I'd become. "Rachel has always been special," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet ballroom. "From the moment she came into our lives, she brought joy and light to our family. Margaret and I have been blessed beyond measure to be her parents." I was touched by his words, but I noticed something odd in his phrasing. He said, "From the moment she came into our lives, rather than from the moment she was born." It was a subtle difference, but it struck me as strange. As Dad continued his toast, I glanced over at my mother. She was staring at him with what could only be described as terror, her knuckles white as she gripped her champagne glass. Dr. Crawford sat beside her, looking equally uncomfortable. Even more puzzling, Aunt Ellie was watching my mother with an expression of growing concern. "Rachel, you have brought us more happiness than you could possibly know," Dad concluded, raising his glass. "To Rachel and David, may your marriage be filled with all the love and joy you deserve." The guests raised their glasses and cheered, but I was distracted by the strange undercurrents I was sensing among the people closest to me. Something was definitely wrong, and it seemed to center around me, though I couldn't understand what it could be. As the evening progressed, I tried to push aside my concerns and focus on celebrating with David and our guests. We cut the cake, a towering creation of vanilla and raspberry that had taken the baker 3 days to construct. We danced to our favorite songs, and David spun me around the floor while our guests clapped and cheered. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous was building, like the electrical charge in the air before a thunderstorm. My mother continued to act strangely, avoiding eye contact with me and staying close to Dr. Crawford throughout the evening. Several times I caught Aunt Ellie watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher, as if she were seeing me for the first time. It was nearly 10 o'clock when everything changed. The band had just finished playing Sweet Caroline, and guests were mingling on the dance floor and around the bar. I was standing near the head table, talking with some of David's colleagues from his engineering firm, when I heard my mother's voice rise above the music and conversation. She was standing about 20 feet away, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Dr. Crawford and Aunt Ellie. Even from a distance, I could see that she was agitated, her usually composed demeanor completely shattered. Her voice grew louder, though I still couldn't make out the words. David noticed my distraction and followed my gaze. "Is your mom okay?" "She looks upset." Before I could answer, my mother's voice cut through the ambient noise of the reception like a knife. The words she spoke would haunt me for the rest of my life, not just because of what she said, but because of the raw anguish in her voice as she said them. "You're not my daughter!" The ballroom fell silent. 200 guests turned to stare as my mother stood there trembling, her face twisted with emotion. Dr. Crawford reached for her arm, trying to calm her, but my mother pulled away violently. "You're not my daughter!" she repeated, this time looking directly at me with tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face as every eye in the room turned to me. David's hand found mine, squeezing tightly, but I could barely feel it. The beautiful ballroom, the elegant decorations, the faces of our loved ones, everything seemed to blur around the edges as my mother's words echoed in my mind. In that moment, standing in my wedding dress surrounded by the ruins of what had been the perfect day, I realized that my entire life had been built on a lie. The woman who had raised me, who had planned this beautiful wedding, who had been my mother for 26 years, was telling me that none of it was real. The truth that would emerge over the next few hours would not only destroy the fantasy of my perfect family, but would also reveal a web of secrets, lies, and betrayals that went back decades. And standing in that crowd of shocked wedding guests was the one person who held the key to everything, someone who had been watching and waiting for this moment for 26 years. The chaos that erupted after my mother's outburst was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Wedding guests began murmuring among themselves, their voices creating a low buzz of confusion and shock that filled the elegant ballroom. Some people pulled out their phones, capturing what they probably thought was a dramatic family argument that would make for interesting social media content. Others simply stared, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't heard anything. David's arm tightened around my waist as I stood frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The woman who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with homework, who had held me when I cried over my first heartbreak, was now claiming I wasn't her daughter. The wedding dress that had felt so perfect moments before now seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. My father rushed across the dance floor, his face a mixture of panic and fury. He reached my mother just as she collapsed into one of the gold-rimmed chairs that surrounded the dance floor, her emerald dress pooling around her like spilled paint. The elegant updo that had taken 2 hours to perfect was now disheveled, with strands of auburn hair falling across her tear-streaked face. "Margaret, what have you done?" Dad's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the stunned silence of the ballroom, everyone could hear him clearly. He knelt beside her chair, his construction worker hands surprisingly gentle as he tried to take hers. We agreed we would never speak of this. The wedding coordinator, an efficient woman named Linda, who had managed hundreds of events at Sunset Manor, approached our family with the practiced composure of someone accustomed to handling crises. "Perhaps we could move this conversation to a more private location," she suggested diplomatically, gesturing toward the smaller conference room adjacent to the ballroom. But my mother shook her head violently, her green eyes wild with something that looked like relief mixed with terror. "No more hiding," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "I've carried this secret for 26 years, and I can't do it anymore. Not on her wedding day. Not when she looks so much like—" She didn't finish the sentence, but her eyes found someone in the crowd. Following her gaze, I saw Aunt Ellie standing near the bar, her usually warm expression replaced by something much more complex. Dr. Crawford stood beside her, and for the first time I noticed how they were looking at each other with the familiarity of old conspirators. "Like who, Mom?" I finally found my voice, though it sounded strange and distant to my own ears. Who do I look like? The question hung in the air like a challenge. My mother looked up at me from her chair, mascara creating dark trails down her cheeks. For a moment I saw the woman who had bandaged my scraped knees and celebrated every one of my achievements. And my heart ached with confusion and loss. Aunt Ellie stepped forward from the crowd, her silver hair catching the light from the chandeliers. She moved with purpose, and I noticed that several guests stepped aside to let her pass, as if they sensed she was somehow central to whatever was unfolding. "Margaret," Ellie said softly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to handling medical emergencies. "This isn't the time or place for this conversation. When would be the right time, Eleanor?" My mother shot back, using Aunt Ellie's full name in a way that sounded almost accusatory. "When she has children of her own? When she starts asking questions about family medical history? When she needs to know the truth about her heritage?" Heritage. The word struck me like a physical blow. I felt David's concerned gaze on my face, and I realized that my hands were shaking so violently that my bouquet was trembling. One of the white roses had already fallen to the marble floor. My sister Carolyn pushed through the crowd, her pregnancy making her movements awkward but determined. "Mom, you're scaring everyone," she said, reaching for our mother's hand. "Whatever this is about, we can discuss it as a family later." "That's just it," Mom replied, looking at Carolyn with an expression of profound sadness. "We're not all family." "Not in the way you think." The implications of her words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the ballroom. I found myself studying the faces around me, looking for clues I had somehow missed my entire life. My father's blue eyes were filled with anguish, but also something that looked like guilt. Carolyn's face showed genuine confusion, suggesting she was as shocked as I was by these revelations. Dr. Crawford finally stepped forward, her medical training apparently overriding whatever personal concerns had kept her silent. "Rachel, dear, perhaps you should sit down. You look pale." I shook my head, my journalist instincts finally kicking in despite my emotional turmoil. If my mother was determined to reveal family secrets in front of 200 wedding guests, then I was going to get answers to the questions that were burning in my mind. "If I'm not your daughter," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, "then whose daughter am I?" The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning system humming and the distant sound of traffic on the road outside Sunset Manor. My mother looked at Aunt Ellie again, and this time I saw something pass between them that looked like a wordless conversation. "Tell her," Ellie said quietly, her blue eyes fixed on my mother's face. "She deserves to know the truth." My mother took a shuddering breath and stood up slowly, smoothing down her emerald dress with trembling hands. When she looked at me, I saw a vulnerability I had never witnessed before, as if she had removed a mask she had been wearing for decades. "Your biological mother was my sister," she said, each word seeming to cost her enormous effort. "My younger sister Catherine, who died when you were 3 months old." The words hit me like a physical force, and I felt my knees buckle slightly. David's arm tightened around me, keeping me upright, but I could barely feel his support. A sister. My mother had a sister I had never heard of, never seen pictures of, who had apparently died and left me an orphan. "You have a sister named Catherine?" Carolyn asked, voicing the question that was echoing in my own mind. "You never told us about any sister." My mother's laugh was bitter and filled with pain. "Catherine was 5 years younger than me. She was beautiful, brilliant, and completely irresponsible. She got involved with a man who was dangerous, who got her into drugs and alcohol. When she became pregnant with Rachel, she was already deep into addiction. I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold, as if I were observing this scene from outside my own body. The elegant ballroom, the wedding guests, even David beside me, seemed to fade into the background as my mother continued her devastating revelation. Catherine tried to get clean when she found out she was pregnant, but it was too difficult. She came to us when she was 7 months along, begging for help. She was sick, frightened, and had nowhere else to go. Aunt Ellie moved closer, and I noticed that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I was working at Cedar Ridge Hospital then," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "I helped arrange for Catherine to stay with Margaret and Frank during the final months of her pregnancy. The plan was for her to get healthy, have the baby, and then decide what she wanted to do about her future. But she didn't get healthy," my mother continued, her voice breaking. "The drugs had damaged her system more than we realized. She developed complications during delivery, and then afterward, she couldn't seem to bond with you. She would disappear for days, leaving you with us. When you were 3 months old, she overdosed in a motel room in Hartford. The revelation hit me like a tsunami, washing away everything I thought I knew about myself and my family. I wasn't Margaret and Frank Donovan's biological daughter. I was the child of a drug-addicted woman who had died when I was barely old enough to hold up my own head. The loving childhood I remembered, the sense of belonging I had always felt despite occasional doubts, had been built on a foundation of lies and well-intentioned deception. So you just kept me," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to myself. "You pretended I was yours." "We didn't pretend." My father spoke for the first time since my mother's initial outburst. His voice was thick with emotion, and I could see tears threatening in his blue eyes. "We loved you from the moment Catherine placed you in Margaret's arms. When she died, there was never any question about what we would do. You were already our daughter in every way that mattered. Except legally," Dr. Crawford interjected, and I sensed there was more to this story than simple adoption. There were complications with the adoption process because of Catherine's involvement with dangerous people. The man who fathered Rachel was connected to some very unsavory characters, and there were concerns about custody challenges. I felt like Alice falling down the rabbit hole, with each new piece of information making my reality stranger and more disorienting. Not only was I not my parents' biological child, but my biological father was apparently some kind of criminal who might have fought for custody rights. "What kind of complications?" I asked, my legal mind finally engaging despite my emotional turmoil. Aunt Ellie and my mother exchanged another loaded glance before Ellie stepped forward. "The adoption was never finalized through official channels," she admitted. "Margaret and Frank applied for guardianship, but the paperwork was irregular. There were concerns that if certain people discovered your existence and location, it could put you and the family in danger." The implications of what she was saying slowly penetrated my shocked consciousness. For 26 years, I had been living under an assumed identity. My birth certificate, my social security number, my entire legal existence was apparently based on falsified documents created to protect me from some unknown threat. "Are you telling me," I said slowly, "that my entire life has been a lie? That even my name isn't real?" "Your name is real," my mother said quickly. "Catherine named you Rachel before she died. That part was always true. But Donovan isn't my real last name." The silence that followed was answer enough. I felt David's hand squeeze mine, and I realized that he was probably as shocked as I was by these revelations about the woman he had just married. We had dated for 3 years, lived together for 1, and planned to spend our lives together, yet he was discovering that I didn't even know my own true identity. "What was my mother's last name?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "What was Catherine's last name?" Another pause, another exchange of glances between the adults who had apparently been keeping this secret for my entire life. "Catherine's last name was Hayes," Aunt Ellie said quietly. "She was my daughter." The revelation hit me like a lightning bolt. Aunt Ellie, whom I had loved and trusted my entire life, whom I had considered a beloved family friend, was actually my grandmother. The woman I had called Aunt Ellie was my biological grandmother, and she had been watching me grow up from a distance, unable to claim me as her own granddaughter. I stared at her, seeing her familiar features in a completely new light. The blue eyes that I had always thought looked kind were actually my eyes, inherited through genetics rather than coincidence. The silver hair that had once been the same dark brown as mine, the hands that had always seemed so gentle when she bandaged my childhood scrapes were the hands of my grandmother. "You're my grandmother," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Ellie nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I've wanted to tell you every day for 26 years," she whispered. "Watching you grow up, celebrating your achievements, being present for the important moments but not being able to acknowledge our real relationship has been the hardest thing I've ever done. Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out more as an accusation than I had intended, but I was beyond caring about social niceties. "Why did you all decide to lie to me for my entire life?" "Because we were protecting you," my father said firmly. "Catherine's boyfriend, your biological father, was involved with people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt a child if it served their purposes. When Catherine died, there were inquiries made about you. People came looking for Margaret and Frank, asking questions about a baby that Catherine might have had." Dr. Crawford stepped forward, and I realized that her role in this conspiracy was larger than I had initially understood. "I was the attending physician when you were born," she said. "I also signed the death certificate when Catherine passed away." There were irregularities in the documentation that allowed Margaret and Frank to assume custody without going through traditional adoption channels. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was more disturbing than I had imagined. Not only had my entire family lied to me about my identity, but they had apparently falsified legal documents and potentially broken federal laws to maintain their deception. "So I'm not legally their daughter," I said, trying to wrap my mind around the full implications. "I'm not legally a Donovan. My marriage license, my college transcripts, my professional certifications, none of them are valid because they're based on false identity documents." The horror of the situation was beginning to sink in. Beyond the personal betrayal and emotional devastation, there could be serious legal consequences for everyone involved. My parents could face charges for falsifying documents, Dr. Crawford could lose her medical license, and I could potentially face deportation proceedings if my citizenship status was called into question. "There's more," Aunt Ellie said quietly, and I felt my heart sink even further. "Before Catherine died, she told me something about your father. Something that changes everything." I braced myself for another devastating revelation, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. "Your biological father wasn't just involved with criminals," Ellie continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was married to someone else. Someone with significant political connections who couldn't afford the scandal of an illegitimate child born to a drug addict." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with terrifying clarity. I wasn't just the daughter of a dead drug addict and a criminal. I was potentially the illegitimate child of someone powerful enough to make people disappear if they threatened his reputation or career. "Who is he?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I really wanted to know the answer. Aunt Ellie looked around the ballroom, where 200 wedding guests were still watching our family drama unfold with fascination and horror. "This isn't the place for that conversation," she said firmly, "but I think it's time you knew everything. All of it." As I stood there in my wedding dress, surrounded by the ruins of what should have been the happiest day of my life, I realized that my real story was just beginning. The truth about my identity, my family, and the dangerous secrets that had shaped my entire existence was finally coming to light. And somehow, I sensed that the woman I had known as Aunt Ellie was going to be the key to unraveling all of it. The alliance I was about to form with my newly discovered grandmother would lead us down a path of investigation, revelation, and ultimately justice that none of us could have imagined. But first, we had to figure out how to get through the rest of my wedding reception without causing even more of a scandal than we already had. Looking around the ballroom at the shocked faces of our guests, I realized that ship had probably already sailed. The ride back to Ellie's cottage at Lake Harmony was tense and silent. David had insisted on driving, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel of our rental car. I sat in the passenger seat still wearing my wedding dress, though I had removed the veil and most of the elaborate jewelry. In the back seat, Ellie stared out the window at the darkening Connecticut countryside, her silver hair disheveled from the evening's events. We had managed to salvage what remained of the reception by asking Linda, the wedding coordinator, to announce that there had been a family medical emergency requiring immediate attention. Most of the guests had been understanding, though I caught several people taking photos and videos with their phones as we made our hurried exit. By morning, I was certain that the story of my wedding day meltdown would be circulating throughout Millbrook and beyond. My parents had wanted to come with us, but I had refused. The betrayal was too fresh. the hurt too raw for me to handle their presence. Frank had looked devastated when I told him I needed space, and Margaret had broken down crying again, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort them. 26 years of lies weren't something I could forgive in the span of a few hours. Dr. Crawford had slipped me her business card before we left, whispering that she had kept detailed records of everything that had happened with Catherine and my birth. She promised to gather the documentation and meet with us the following day, along with the lawyer who had helped arrange my irregular adoption. The prospect of learning even more disturbing details about my origins filled me with dread. Ellie's cottage was a modest 2-bedroom structure, nestled among tall pine trees on the shore of Lake Harmony. I had visited many times over the years for family gatherings and holiday celebrations, never knowing that I was actually visiting my grandmother's home. The irony wasn't lost on me as David helped me out of the car and we walked up the familiar stone pathway to the front door. Inside, the cottage was exactly as I remembered it. Comfortable furniture covered in floral prints, family photographs covering every surface, and the faint scent of lavender that always reminded me of Ellie's presence. But now I looked at everything with new eyes, searching for clues about my true heritage that I had missed during previous visits. "I'll make some tea," Ellie said quietly, her voice hoarse from crying. "We all need something to calm our nerves." David and I settled on the couch in the living room while Ellie busied herself in the kitchen. I could hear the familiar sounds of her preparing tea, the whistle of the kettle, the clink of china cups, the opening and closing of cabinet doors. These domestic sounds should have been comforting, but instead they felt surreal given everything that had just been revealed. "How are you holding up?" David asked softly, taking my hand in his. His brown eyes were filled with concern and confusion, and I realized that he was probably questioning everything he thought he knew about the woman he had just married. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I feel like everything I believed about myself and my family has been turned upside down. I don't even know who I am anymore." David squeezed my hand. "You're still the same person I fell in love with," he said firmly. "Your name might be different, and your family history might be more complicated than we thought. But you're still Rachel. You're still my wife." His words were meant to be comforting, but they raised questions I wasn't ready to confront. Was our marriage even legal if my identity documents were fraudulent? What other complications might arise from learning that my entire existence was based on fabricated paperwork? Ellie returned with a tea service, setting the familiar china cups on the coffee table with trembling hands. The woman I had known as my great-aunt looked older than her 73 years, as if the stress of maintaining decades of secrecy had finally caught up with her. "Where do we start?" I asked as she poured the tea. "What else haven't you told me?" Ellie settled into her favorite armchair and took a sip of tea before responding. "I suppose I should begin with Catherine," she said. "You deserve to know what kind of person your mother really was." She rose and went to an antique secretary desk in the corner of the room, retrieving a thick photo album that I had never seen before. When she returned and opened it, I gasped. The first photograph showed a young woman who looked almost exactly like me, with the same dark brown hair, hazel eyes, and facial structure. The resemblance was so striking it was like looking at a photograph of myself in costume. "This is Catherine at age 22, Ellie explained, pointing to the image. "About a year before she became pregnant with you." I studied the photograph intently, trying to reconcile this beautiful, vibrant-looking young woman with the drug addict my mother had described. Catherine was sitting on a park bench, laughing at something off-camera, her hair catching the sunlight in a way that made it look like spun gold. "She was studying to be a veterinarian," Ellie continued, turning the page to reveal more photographs. Catherine had always loved animals, and she was brilliant at her studies. She was in her second year of veterinary school when she met him. "My biological father," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Ellie nodded grimly. "Richard Blackwood. He was 15 years older than Catherine, married with 2 young children, and already involved in several questionable business ventures. But he was also charming, wealthy, and very good at convincing young women that he could give them everything they wanted." She turned another page, and I saw a photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed Catherine at what appeared to be an upscale restaurant, sitting across from a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. Even though the photograph was more than 25 years old, I recognized him immediately. "That's Congressman Blackwood," David said, voicing what I was thinking. "Richard Blackwood, the one who's been in the news lately for his campaign finance scandals." I stared at the photograph, trying to process the implications of what I was seeing. Richard Blackwood was currently serving his 6th term in the House of Representatives, representing Connecticut's 2nd District. He was married to Patricia Blackwood, a prominent socialite and philanthropist, and they had 2 adult children who were both successful in their own right. He was also being investigated by the FBI for accepting illegal campaign contributions from foreign sources. "He's my father," I whispered, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. "According to Catherine, yes," Ellie confirmed. Though he never acknowledged paternity, and Catherine never pursued it legally. She was too afraid of what he might do if she made trouble for him. Ellie turned more pages, showing me photographs of Catherine's gradual decline. The vibrant young woman from the earlier pictures slowly transformed into someone who looked hollow and desperate. Her clothes became less fashionable, her smile less genuine, and her eyes took on the glassy look of someone who was chemically dependent. "Richard promised Catherine that he would leave his wife and marry her," Ellie explained. "He set her up in an apartment in Hartford and gave her money for school. But as time went on, it became clear that he had no intention of keeping his promises. When Catherine threatened to tell his wife about their relationship, he cut off all financial support and had her evicted from the apartment." "That's when she started using drugs?" I asked, though I could already see the answer in the photographs. "She was devastated by his betrayal," Ellie said sadly. "Catherine had always been sensitive. And she didn't handle rejection well. She dropped out of veterinary school and fell in with a crowd that introduced her to cocaine and alcohol. By the time she discovered she was pregnant, she was already heavily addicted." I studied a photograph of Catherine taken during what must have been her pregnancy. She looked thin and sickly, her face gaunt and her eyes sunken. It was heartbreaking to see how far she had fallen from the radiant young woman in the earlier pictures. "Did Richard know about the pregnancy?" David asked, clearly following the same line of thinking that was occurring to me. Ellie's expression darkened. Catherine told him, yes. His response was to offer her money for an abortion, and to threaten her if she ever tried to contact him again. When she refused the abortion, he made it clear that he would destroy her if she ever claimed he was the father. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was more sinister than I had imagined. My biological father wasn't just an unfaithful husband who had abandoned his pregnant mistress. He was someone with enough power and influence to make serious threats and follow through on them. "Is that why all the secrecy was necessary?" I asked. "Because Richard Blackwood threatened Catherine?" "Partly," Ellie admitted, "but there was more to it than that." After Catherine died, Richard's people came looking for information about whether she had given birth. They were thorough and persistent, and it became clear that they weren't just asking out of curiosity. She closed the photo album and looked at me directly. "Margaret and Frank were terrified that if Richard discovered your existence, he would either try to take you away or worse. A congressman with presidential ambitions couldn't afford to have an illegitimate daughter with a drug addict mother, especially one who might grow up to ask inconvenient questions." The implications of what she was saying were staggering. For 26 years, my adoptive family had been protecting me from a man who saw me as a threat to his political career. They had falsified documents, created false identities, and lived with the constant fear that their deception would be discovered. "But I'm an adult now," I pointed out. "I'm married, I have a career, I'm not dependent on anyone for support. What could he possibly do to me at this point?" Ellie and David exchanged a glance that told me I was being naive about the reach of political power and influence. "Rachel," David said gently, "your entire legal identity is based on fraudulent documents. If Richard Blackwood wanted to destroy your life, all he would have to do is expose the truth about your birth certificate and social security number. You could lose your job, face criminal charges for identity fraud, and potentially be deported if your citizenship status is called into question." The reality of my situation began to sink in with terrifying clarity. I wasn't just dealing with family secrets and personal betrayal. I was potentially caught in a web of political corruption and criminal activity that could destroy everything I had worked to build. There's something else, Ellie said quietly. Something I discovered recently that changes everything. She rose again and went to the secretary desk, this time removing a manila folder that looked much newer than the photo album. When she returned and opened it, I saw newspaper clippings, printed internet articles, and what appeared to be official documents. I've been keeping track of Richard Blackwood's activities over the years, she explained. Not just his political career, but his business dealings and personal life. 6 months ago, I discovered something that I think you need to know. She handed me a newspaper clipping from the Hartford Courant dated 3 months earlier. The headline read, "Congressman Blackwood's daughter dies in suspicious car accident." I read the article with growing horror. Melissa Blackwood, Richard's 28-year-old daughter from his marriage, had died when her car went off the road late one night on a rural highway outside Hartford. According to the article, police suspected that alcohol might have been involved, though toxicology results were still pending. The accident had occurred just 2 weeks after Melissa had been arrested for cocaine possession. She was an addict, I said, looking up at Ellie. Just like Catherine. There's more, Ellie said grimly. She handed me another clipping, this one from a smaller local newspaper. This is about Richard's son, Michael Blackwood. The second article described how Michael Blackwood, 31 years old and a partner in a prestigious law firm, had been found dead in his office from what appeared to be a drug overdose. The death had occurred just 6 weeks after his sister's car accident. Both of his legitimate children are dead, I whispered, the implications hitting me like a physical blow. Both died under suspicious circumstances, Ellie corrected. Both had struggled with addiction, just like Catherine. Both died within 2 months of each other, right around the time that Richard was beginning to face serious legal troubles from the FBI investigation. David leaned forward, his expression grim. You think he killed his own children? I think Richard Blackwood is capable of anything if he believes his political survival is at stake, Ellie replied. And I think the fact that his legitimate heirs are now dead makes Rachel a very dangerous person to him. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying logic. If Richard Blackwood had indeed murdered his own children to prevent them from becoming liabilities during his legal troubles, then my existence as his illegitimate daughter represented an even greater threat. I was living proof of his extramarital affairs and questionable character, and unlike his deceased children, I was completely outside his control. We need to be very careful about how we proceed, Ellie said, her voice taking on the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. If Richard discovers that you know the truth about your parentage, you could be in serious danger. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air coming through the cottage windows. My wedding day had begun with dreams of a perfect future with David, and it was ending with the realization that my very existence might put both of us in mortal danger. What do we do? I asked, looking between Ellie and David for guidance. Ellie's expression hardened with determination that reminded me of her nursing background and her years of dealing with medical emergencies. We gather evidence, she said firmly. We document everything we can about Richard's connection to Catherine, his threats against her, and the suspicious deaths of his children. And then we find a way to protect ourselves while exposing the truth. That sounds incredibly dangerous, David pointed out, though I could see in his eyes that he was already committed to helping me regardless of the risks. Living with this secret for the rest of our lives would be more dangerous, I replied, surprised by the strength in my own voice. If Richard Blackwood thinks he can intimidate me the way he intimidated Catherine, he's going to learn that I'm not my mother. As I spoke those words, I felt something shift inside me. The shock and confusion of the evening's revelations were being replaced by a fierce determination to uncover the truth and seek justice for Catherine, for Richard's dead children, and for myself. The alliance between Ellie and me was crystallizing into something powerful and focused. Tomorrow we meet with Dr. Crawford and the lawyer, I said, taking charge of the situation for the first time since my world had been turned upside down. We gather every piece of documentation they have about my birth and adoption. Then we start building a case against Richard Blackwood that will protect us and expose him for what he really is." Ellie smiled for the first time since the wedding reception, and I could see pride in her eyes as she looked at her granddaughter. "Catherine would be proud of the woman you've become," she said softly. As the three of us sat in the lamplight of Ellie's cottage, surrounded by the evidence of decades of secrets and lies, I realized that this was just the beginning of our investigation. The road ahead would be dangerous and uncertain, but for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was and what I needed to do. I was Rachel Hayes, daughter of Catherine Hayes and Richard Blackwood. I was the granddaughter of Eleanor Hayes, a woman who had spent 26 years protecting me from forces I was only beginning to understand. And I was about to become Congressman Richard Blackwood's worst nightmare. The morning after my wedding brought an unexpected visitor to Ellie's cottage. I woke to the sound of urgent knocking at the front door and voices in the living room. Still groggy and emotionally drained from the previous night's revelations, I wrapped myself in one of Ellie's quilted robes and padded barefoot toward the commotion. David was already awake, standing in the hallway with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. Through the doorway, I could see Ellie speaking in hushed tones with a woman I didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and elegant, with short blonde hair and the kind of expensive clothing that suggested wealth and sophistication. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "Rachel," Ellie called when she noticed me in the doorway. "There's someone here you need to meet." The blonde woman turned toward me, and I was struck by her intelligent blue eyes and the way she seemed to be assessing me with professional interest. She extended a manicured hand as I approached. "I'm Victoria Ashford," she said, her voice carrying a slight Southern accent. "I'm an investigative journalist with the Washington Herald. I've been working on a story about your biological father for the past 8 months." I felt David tense beside me as I shook Victoria's hand. The idea that a reporter was already investigating Richard Blackwood should have been reassuring, but instead it filled me with apprehension. The last thing I wanted was to become a pawn in someone else's agenda. "How did you know to find me here?" I asked, settling onto the couch while David remained standing protectively nearby. Victoria smiled grimly. "I've been monitoring Richard Blackwood's activities very closely. When his security team started making inquiries about a wedding reception in Millbrook yesterday evening, it raised red flags. I have sources who keep me informed about his movements and interests." The implications of her words hit me immediately. Richard already knew about my wedding day revelation. Somehow he had learned that his secret had been exposed, and he was already taking action to protect himself. "What kind of inquiries?" Ellie asked, her nursing instincts clearly activated by the potential threat to my safety. "Phone calls to the country club, questions about the guest list, requests for security footage from the reception," Victoria replied. "Richard's people are very efficient when they want information. I suspect they'll have a complete dossier on you within 24 hours, if they don't already." I felt a chill of fear that had nothing to do with the morning air coming through the cottage windows. The idea that Richard Blackwood was already investigating me made the danger feel immediate and personal in a way it hadn't the night before. "Why are you telling us this?" David asked, his voice carefully controlled. "What do you want from Rachel?" Victoria reached into her leather briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Because I believe Rachel's story is the key to exposing Richard Blackwood for what he really is. I've been investigating his connection to several suspicious deaths, including those of his own children, but I've been missing crucial pieces of evidence. Rachel's existence, and the circumstances of her birth, could provide the proof I need to bring him down." She opened the folder and spread several documents across Ellie's coffee table. I recognized some of them as newspaper clippings about Melissa and Michael Blackwood's deaths, but others were unfamiliar. There were financial records, phone logs, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. "This is evidence of Richard's involvement in campaign finance violations, money laundering, and potentially murder," Victoria explained. "But it's all circumstantial. What I need is direct proof of his character and willingness to eliminate threats to his political career." I studied the documents, trying to make sense of the complex web of corruption they revealed. The financial records showed large cash payments to various individuals whose names I didn't recognize. The phone logs indicated calls made at suspicious times to numbers registered to private security companies. The surveillance photographs showed Richard meeting with men who looked like the kind of people you wouldn't want to encounter in a dark alley. "Where did you get all this?" I asked, impressed despite my wariness. "I have sources inside the FBI investigation," Victoria replied. "Agents who believe Richard is guilty, but are being pressured by their superiors to limit the scope of their inquiry. Political corruption cases are always complicated when the subject has as much influence as Richard Blackwood." Ellie leaned forward, her expression skeptical. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Ashford?" Victoria's eyes lit up with the intensity of someone who lived for investigative challenges. "I want to work with Rachel to gather evidence that proves Richard threatened Catherine and has been systematically eliminating anyone who could expose his secrets. With Rachel's testimony about her family's decades of fear and secrecy, combined with the physical evidence I've already collected, we could build a case that even Richard's political connections couldn't suppress." "That sounds incredibly dangerous," David pointed out, voicing my own concerns. "If Richard is willing to kill his own children, what would stop him from eliminating Rachel?" "Numbers," Victoria replied without hesitation. "Right now, Rachel is a secret threat that Richard can deal with quietly. But if her story becomes public knowledge, if it's part of a major newspaper investigation with documentation and witnesses, killing her would only confirm his guilt. The key is making sure the story gets out before he has a chance to silence her." I found myself considering her proposal despite the obvious risks. The alternative was spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when Richard might decide that my existence had become too much of a liability. At least Victoria's plan offered the possibility of permanently neutralizing the threat. "What would you need from me?" I asked, ignoring David's sharp look of concern. Victoria pulled out a digital recorder and set it on the coffee table. "I need you to tell me everything you remember about growing up as a Donovan. Every story your family told you about your childhood. Every explanation they gave for your appearance. Every moment when you suspected something wasn't quite right about your origins. I need details about how terrified your adoptive parents were of discovery, evidence of the elaborate measures they took to hide your true identity." She paused and looked directly into my eyes. "And I need you to be willing to go on the record with all of it. This won't work if you're an anonymous source. Richard's power comes from his ability to operate in shadows. The only way to defeat him is to drag everything into the light." The prospect of making my personal trauma public knowledge was daunting, but I thought about Catherine dying alone in a motel room, about Melissa and Michael Blackwood's suspicious deaths, about the 26 years my adoptive parents had lived in fear of discovery. Sometimes justice required courage, even when that courage came with significant personal cost. "Before I agree to anything," I said, "I want to see what documentation you already have about Catherine and Richard's relationship. I want to know exactly what evidence exists to support our claims." Victoria nodded approvingly. "Smart approach. I have copies of hotel receipts showing Richard paid for Catherine's apartment in Hartford, credit card records proving he bought her jewelry and expensive gifts, phone records showing hundreds of calls between them over a 2-year period. I even have a witness who saw them together multiple times and overheard Richard promising to leave his wife." She reached into her briefcase again and withdrew another folder. "This is the most damaging evidence," she said, handing me a single sheet of paper. "It's a copy of a check Richard wrote to Catherine for $5,000. The memo line says, 'Final payment,' and it's dated 2 weeks after Catherine died." I stared at the document, trying to process its implications. Richard had paid Catherine money after her death, which could only mean he was paying someone else to keep quiet about their relationship or to handle some aspect of the aftermath of her overdose. "Who received this payment?" David asked, reading over my shoulder. "A private investigator named Marcus Webb," Victoria replied. "He specializes in handling delicate situations for wealthy clients. Based on my research, Richard hired him to locate any evidence of Catherine's pregnancy and to ensure that no inconvenient children surfaced later to complicate his political career." The revelation sent a shiver of fear down my spine. For 26 years, there had been someone actively searching for me, someone paid by Richard to eliminate any trace of my existence. The fact that I had remained hidden was a testament to my adoptive family's careful planning, but it also meant the threat had always been real. "Is this investigator still working for Richard?" Ellie asked, her voice tight with concern. Victoria's expression darkened. "Marcus Webb died in a boating accident 3 years ago. Another suspicious death connected to Richard Blackwood, though it's impossible to prove direct involvement." The pattern was becoming clear. Richard Blackwood eliminated threats to his political survival with ruthless efficiency. Whether they were former mistresses, inconvenient children, or hired investigators who knew too much about his secrets, the fact that I had survived this long was probably due more to luck than anything else. "There's something else you should know," Victoria continued. "The FBI investigation into Richard's campaign finance violations is scheduled to conclude next month. If they don't find evidence of criminal wrongdoing by then, the case will likely be closed due to political pressure from Richard's allies in Congress. This is our only window of opportunity to expose the truth before he becomes untouchable." The urgency of the situation crystallized my decision. I couldn't spend the rest of my life hiding from Richard Blackwood, and I couldn't allow him to escape justice for what he had done to Catherine, to his own children, and to who knows how many other victims over the years. "I'll do it," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I'll tell you everything, go on the record, and help you build your case against Richard." David reached for my hand, his expression conflicted. "Rachel, are you sure about this? Once this story comes out, there's no going back. Your entire life will change." "My entire life has already changed," I replied. "Yesterday I was Rachel Donovan, happily married daughter of a respected Millbrook family. Today I'm Rachel Hayes, illegitimate daughter of a congressman who murders people to protect his secrets. I can either hide from that truth or use it to make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Victoria smiled with genuine admiration. "Catherine would be proud of your courage," she said, echoing Ellie's words from the night before. Over the next several hours, I told Victoria everything I could remember about growing up as a Donovan. I described the subtle ways my adoptive parents had always seemed nervous about my resemblance to unknown relatives, their reluctance to discuss family medical history, their overprotective approach to my safety and privacy. I recounted moments when I had caught them whispering about things they couldn't explain, phone calls that stopped abruptly when I entered the room, and their intense reaction anytime I expressed interest in genealogy or family research. Victoria recorded every word, occasionally asking follow-up questions that helped clarify important details. She was particularly interested in the timing of certain family moves and the reasons my adoptive parents had given for changing doctors, schools, and even churches during my childhood. They were constantly covering their tracks, quote, Victoria observed as we reviewed my testimony. The pattern of behavior suggests they lived in constant fear of discovery. That level of sustained anxiety doesn't develop from simple adoption concerns. They were genuinely terrified of Richard Blackwood. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Crawford arrived with the lawyer who had helped arrange my irregular adoption. Patricia Winters was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes who had clearly handled sensitive legal matters for decades. She brought a briefcase full of documents that painted a disturbing picture of the lengths to which my adoptive family had gone to hide my true identity. "The falsification of your birth certificate was extremely sophisticated," Patricia explained as she spread the documents across Ellie's dining table. "It required cooperation from hospital personnel, government officials, and even cemetery workers, who could verify the burial of Catherine Hayes without any mention of surviving children." She handed me a copy of what appeared to be my original birth certificate, listing Catherine Hayes as my mother, and the father's identity as unknown. The document looked official, but there was something unsettling about seeing my existence reduced to a few lines of bureaucratic text. "This is the version that exists in state records," Patricia continued. "The birth certificate you've used your entire life lists Margaret and Frank Donovan as your biological parents. Creating and maintaining 2 sets of official documentation required significant financial resources and political connections." "Political connections?" David asked, clearly thinking along the same lines as I was. Dr. Crawford spoke up for the first time since arriving. "Some of the officials who helped with Rachel's documentation were later appointed to federal positions." she said quietly. Judgeships, administrative roles, advisory committees. It's possible they were rewarded for their cooperation, though proving quid pro quo relationships would be nearly impossible after all these years. The implications were staggering. Richard Blackwood's corruption extended far beyond campaign finance violations and suspicious deaths. He had apparently used his political influence to create an entire network of officials willing to falsify government documents and cover up inconvenient truths. Victoria looked up from her notes with excitement. "This is exactly what I needed," she said. Evidence of systematic corruption spanning decades, with documentation and witnesses. Combined with Rachel's testimony and the suspicious deaths of Richard's children, this paints a picture of a man who will stop at nothing to protect his political career. As evening approached, Victoria prepared to leave with copies of all the documentation we had gathered. She planned to spend the next few days writing her story and coordinating with her editors to ensure maximum impact when it was published. "The article will run in this Sunday's edition," she announced as she packed her briefcase. Front page, above the fold, with a follow-up investigation scheduled for the following week. By Monday morning, Richard Blackwood's name will be associated with murder, corruption, and systematic abuse of power. "What happens after the story comes out?" I asked, suddenly aware that we had set events in motion that would have consequences far beyond our ability to control. Victoria's expression grew serious. "Richard will fight back hard. He'll claim the story is fabricated, attack your credibility, and use every resource at his disposal to discredit the investigation. You need to be prepared for a media circus, legal challenges, and potentially physical threats." "Physical threats?" David repeated, his protective instincts clearly activated. "Richard has a history of eliminating problems," Victoria replied bluntly. "Once this story breaks, you'll be the most dangerous person in his world. We're arranging protective custody through the FBI agents who are cooperating with the investigation, but you should plan to disappear from public view until Richard is arrested." As Victoria drove away into the gathering darkness, I stood on Ellie's porch with David and my grandmother, watching the taillights disappear around the lake. Tomorrow, preparations would begin for the media storm that would reshape all our lives. Sunday, Richard Blackwood would wake up to find his darkest secrets splashed across the front page of one of Washington's most influential newspapers. But tonight, for perhaps the last time in my life, I could stand quietly with the people I loved and pretend that we were just an ordinary family dealing with ordinary problems. The calm before the storm was almost over, and once it began, nothing would ever be the same again. Sunday morning arrived with an unusual silence that felt ominous rather than peaceful. David and I had spent the night at a safe house arranged by Victoria's FBI contacts, a modest ranch home in a quiet suburb outside Hartford. The anonymity of the location was meant to be comforting, but instead it made me feel like a fugitive from my own life. My phone had been buzzing incessantly since dawn, with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Victoria had warned us that once the Washington Herald hit newsstands, the media feeding frenzy would begin immediately. By 7 o'clock, she texted to confirm that her story was the lead article, accompanied by photographs of Richard Blackwood, Catherine, and even a picture of me from my high school yearbook that someone had managed to dig up. The headline read, "Congressman's secret daughter reveals decades of murder and cover-up." Below it was a smaller tagline, "Exclusive investigation exposes Richard Blackwood's history of eliminating threats to political career." Agent Sarah Mitchell, the FBI investigator who was coordinating our protection, arrived at 8 o'clock with coffee and updates on the developing situation. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with graying hair, and the kind of alert eyes that suggested she had seen every type of criminal behavior imaginable. "Richard's already responded through his lawyer," she announced as she settled at our kitchen table. "Complete denial. Claims of political persecution. The usual deflection tactics. But his legal team is scrambling, which suggests they're taking the allegations seriously." She opened her laptop and showed us the official statement that had been released an hour earlier. Richard's spokesperson called the article a desperate attempt by liberal media to destroy a conservative champion, and claimed that all allegations were, quote, based on the fantasies of unstable individuals seeking attention and money. He's following the standard playbook, Agent Mitchell explained. Deny everything, attack the credibility of accusers, and claim political motivation. What's interesting is what he's not doing. What do you mean? I asked, studying Richard's photograph on the screen, and trying to reconcile the distinguished-looking congressman with the monster who had terrorized my biological mother. He's not threatening to sue for defamation, she replied. Politicians usually fire off cease and desist letters immediately when they're falsely accused. The fact that his lawyers haven't taken that step suggests they know the evidence is solid enough to survive legal scrutiny. David leaned forward, his expression grim. What about the physical threats Victoria mentioned? Should we be worried about retaliation? Agent Mitchell's face darkened. We're taking those concerns very seriously. Richard has connections to private security companies that employ former military and intelligence personnel. We've placed a protective detail around Ellie's cottage and are monitoring Richard's known associates for any suspicious activity. As if summoned by her words, my phone rang with a call from Ellie. When I answered, her voice was shaky but determined. Rachel, dear, there are reporters camped outside my cottage, she said. They've been here since sunrise, trying to get me to comment on the story. But there's something else you need to know. I put the call on speaker so Agent Mitchell and David could hear. About an hour ago, a man came to my door claiming to be a federal marshal with a warrant for my arrest, Ellie continued. He was very convincing, had official-looking credentials, but something felt wrong about the whole encounter. Agent Mitchell grabbed the phone. Mrs. Hayes, this is Agent Mitchell with the FBI. Can you describe this man? Tall, probably 6 feet, dark hair, expensive suit. He had a badge and identification that looked legitimate, but he was asking strange questions about Rachel's whereabouts rather than focusing on whatever I was supposedly being arrested for. Did you let him inside? Absolutely not. I told him to wait on the porch while I called my lawyer, and he left immediately. Real federal agents don't usually retreat when citizens assert their legal rights. Agent Mitchell's expression grew urgent. We're sending a team to your location immediately. Don't open the door for anyone until our agents arrive and identify themselves with the code word Harmony. After ending the call, she turned to us with barely controlled anger. This confirms our worst fears. Richard is already moving to silence potential witnesses. The fake marshal was probably there to kidnap Ellie, or worse. The reality of our situation hit me with devastating clarity. We weren't just dealing with political corruption or media attention. We were fighting for our lives against a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to kill anyone who threatened his carefully constructed public image. My phone rang again, this time with a call from Victoria. Her voice was excited but strained when I answered. Rachel, the story is exploding across social media and cable news. Every major network is picking it up, and several other newspapers are rushing to follow up with their own investigations. Richard's office has been flooded with calls from reporters demanding comment. That's good news, right? I asked, though Agent Mitchell's concerned expression suggested otherwise. Yes and no, Victoria replied. The widespread coverage makes it harder for Richard to suppress the story, but it also increases the pressure on him to take dramatic action. Desperate people do desperate things, and Richard Blackwood is definitely desperate right now. She paused, and I could hear the sound of a television in the background. There's something else. Patricia Blackwood, Richard's wife, just announced that she's filing for divorce and requesting a restraining order against her husband. She's also hired her own legal team to cooperate with any criminal investigations. The significance of Patricia's defection wasn't lost on any of us. Richard's wife had access to decades of financial records, private conversations, and intimate knowledge of his business dealings. If she was willing to testify against him, it would provide corroborating evidence for all the allegations in Victoria's article. How long before he's arrested? David asked Agent Mitchell. That depends on how quickly the U.S. attorney can build a case strong enough to survive Richard's inevitable legal challenges, she replied. With his political connections and expensive lawyers, they'll want to be absolutely certain they have enough evidence to secure convictions. As the day progressed, developments came rapidly. By noon, 3 more women had come forward, claiming to have had affairs with Richard Blackwood during the past decade. 2 of them had given birth to children they claimed were his, and both had received mysterious payments to remain silent about paternity. A former campaign aide also contacted Victoria with evidence of Richard's involvement in money laundering schemes connected to his foreign donors. The aide had secretly recorded conversations where Richard discussed using shell companies to hide illegal contributions from Russian businessmen. Most damaging of all, a private investigator named Thomas Shaw contacted the FBI with evidence that Richard had hired him to conduct surveillance on his own children in the months before their deaths. Shaw had recordings of Richard expressing frustration that Melissa and Michael were becoming liabilities due to their drug problems and increasingly erratic behavior. By evening, the pressure had become too much for Richard to withstand. Agent Mitchell received word that he had been spotted at a private airfield outside Washington, apparently attempting to flee the country. Federal agents intercepted him, just as he was boarding a plane bound for a non-extradition country in South America. The arrest was captured by news helicopters and broadcast live across every major network. Watching Richard Blackwood being led away in handcuffs felt surreal after spending 26 years living in fear of a man I had never even met. "It's over," Agent Mitchell announced as we watched the coverage. "He'll be charged with multiple felonies, including conspiracy to commit murder, campaign finance violations, and obstruction of justice. With his wife's cooperation and the evidence we've gathered, he's looking at life in prison." The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with sadness for all the lives Richard had destroyed in service of his political ambitions. Catherine would never see justice for what he had done to her, and his legitimate children had paid the ultimate price for having the misfortune to be born to a sociopathic father. 3 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in Hartford watching Richard Blackwood plead guilty to 17 felony charges. The man who had once seemed untouchable sat hunched at the defendant's table, his political career and personal freedom destroyed by the truth he had spent decades trying to hide. Patricia Blackwood's testimony had been devastating, revealing a pattern of threats, manipulation, and violence that extended far beyond what any of us had initially suspected. She described years of living in fear, watching Richard eliminate business partners who became inconvenient, and silence former associates who knew too much about his criminal activities. The judge sentenced Richard to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling his crimes a betrayal of public trust so profound that no punishment could adequately address the harm he has caused to American democracy and the rule of law. As the bailiff led Richard away for the final time, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The man who had terrorized Catherine, murdered his own children, and forced my adoptive family to live in constant fear would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the most meaningful moment came afterward, when Ellie and I visited Catherine's grave for the first time. My adoptive parents had finally revealed its location, a small cemetery outside Hartford, where Catherine was buried under a simple headstone that read only, "Beloved daughter." "She would be proud of you," Ellie said as we placed fresh flowers on the grave. "You found the courage she never could to stand up to Richard and demand justice." David squeezed my hand as we stood together in the peaceful cemetery. Our marriage had survived the revelation of my true identity, though it had required legal assistance to ensure that our union remained valid, despite the questions about my documentation. I had also undergone the complex process of legally establishing my true identity as Rachel Hayes. With Patricia Winter's help, we had navigated the bureaucratic maze of correcting decades of falsified records and obtaining legitimate documentation of my citizenship and legal status. The story of my wedding day revelation had become a national sensation, inspiring congressional hearings about political corruption and leading to new legislation designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse of power that Richard had practiced for decades. Victoria Ashford won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting, and she used her newfound prominence to continue exposing corruption among powerful political figures. She remained a close friend and ally, someone who understood the cost of seeking truth in a world where powerful people would kill to protect their secrets. My adoptive parents, Margaret and Frank, had eventually been forgiven for their decades of deception. The depth of their love and the sacrifices they had made to protect me became clear once I understood the true nature of the threats they had been defending against. We rebuilt our relationship slowly, with new honesty about the past and hope for the future. As David and I drove home from the cemetery that day, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that September morning, when I had put on my wedding dress expecting to begin the happiest chapter of my life. Instead, I had discovered devastating truths about my origins, exposed a murderous congressman, and found the strength to fight for justice against seemingly impossible odds. The alliance with Ellie, that had begun in my moment of greatest shock and betrayal, had evolved into the most important relationship of my life. She was not just my grandmother, but my partner in seeking truth, and my guide in understanding the complex legacy of Catherine's life and death. Standing in our new home, looking at the framed photograph of Catherine that now occupied a place of honor on our mantelpiece, I knew that my real story had just begun. I was no longer Rachel Donovan, the sheltered daughter of a Millbrook construction family. I was Rachel Hayes, granddaughter of Eleanor Hayes, daughter of Catherine Hayes, and the woman who had brought down Congressman Richard Blackwood. The truth had indeed set me free, though the freedom had come at a price I could never have imagined when I walked down the aisle on what should have been the happiest day of my life. But as I looked toward the future with David beside me and Ellie's wisdom to guide me, I knew that the price had been worth paying. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and some truths are too important to remain hidden. My mother's screaming revelation at my wedding had destroyed the comfortable lies I had lived with my entire life, but it had also given me the power to seek justice and build a future based on authentic truth rather than convenient fiction. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.